Okay, if I could ask you all to mute yourselves, because I don't think normally I can do it, but I don't think I can. Hang on. I'm going to mute you all. There we are. Right. Okay. Still got some coming in. Okay. So you're gonna it's gonna be kind of juggling, I think, a little bit here. We've got people still joining, and we'll make a start in just a moment, as it's, I think, sometime after 8 o'clock. Okay, so I'm gonna see if I can switch camera views now. Oh, yes. There we go. So there we are. Okay, that's a bit better. Right, well, good evening, everybody. Good evening from the Menin Gate. And here we are in the heart of the Ypres salient, Flanders Fields. And we're at the iconic Menin Gate Memorial that commemorates 55,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who have no known grave. And we're standing on a bit of the Menin Road. As I kind of pan round, we're looking down the Menin Road there towards the junction, which takes you up to Hellfire Corner. And during the Great War, many thousands of soldiers crossed this moat bridge, leaving the city of Ypres very often onto a one-way ticket up to the front line. And the evidence of the Great War is still all around us here. I remember a few years ago, in just this street just here, they were doing some work on the road surface. They dug down and they found the bodies of horses from the Great War that had been buried, obviously been killed by shell fire and buried by the side of the road. And their remains were found here. So, you know, it's not just out on those battlefields out there that are the remnants of the Great War. It's kind of everywhere. And so what we're going to do, technology permitting, we're going to go into the gate and we're going to have a look at a few things. And I've got to try and do it without falling over as well while I'm kind of looking at 3 different things at once. So if I occasionally pause, you'll know why. So we're going to start off coming up to the gates, and we've got the Flanders Lions, both on this side of the road and on the other side of the road as well. And these are copies of the originals. And the originals were on display here during the First World War centenary. They were given to Australia just before the Second World War, and they're in the Australian War Museum at Canberra. But these copies kind of mark the ones that originally stood here at the time of the Great War, at this entrance to the city of Ypres, the lion, the kind of obvious symbol of Flanders, looking out across the battlefields. And the originals of these were very heavily peppered with shrapnel. And for quite some years after the war, they were just on display outside the ruins of the Cloth Hall before they were eventually given to Australia. So although these are copies, it's quite nice that they're here, I think, because they kind of echo what was here at the time of the Great War. We're going to go into the gate now. As we mentioned, the Menin Gate, or before we do that, we'll have a quick look down the Moats, because we can't forget the Moats. The gate is here, and we're on the bridge because of the moat, the old moat around the Vauban fortifications of the city of Ypres. There's one of the walls there, the only feature of the city that survived the Great War, these mighty walls built to withstand cannon a couple of hundred years before the Great War, and they still withstood the cannon of the Great War, and this was the only thing that really kind of survived. Within the city itself, everything else was destroyed. And the other thing, as we come up, that we often say on the podcast about the kind of crisscross paths of both the First and the Second World War, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but there are marks on the front of the memorial here, and I'll just go around to the side so you can see it, because the moat bridge that we're standing on here was blown up by the Royal Engineers in May 1940 as the Germans came down the road just ahead of us in that direction there, and the moat was blown, and the Menin Gate Memorial was damaged in the process. And you can often be forgiven for not seeing this, but you can see some kind of indication of it here. This is all shrapnel marks on the side of the gates, indicating the damage that was done by the explosion of that charge by the Royal Engineers here in May 1940. So this is definitely a point in which World War II crosses World War I, or vice versa. And one of the things, of course, to remember about the Menin Gate is not just a British memorial. It's a British and Empire Commonwealth memorial. And as we come in at this angle, the first thing we see are the names of men from the British West Indies Regiment. Now, these were black soldiers from the West Indies who joined up as volunteers at the beginning of the Great War, ready to fight and, if necessary, die for the mother country. And they were trained up as frontline soldiers. When they got to the Somme in 1916, they had their rifles taken away from them and they were given picks and shovels and they were used as labour troops for the rest of the war. But here we see 6 of them commemorated on the Menin Gate. So for a labour unit, that's quite unusual. And what happened here is that these men, during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, were fetching and carrying shells to take up to the gun sites for the fighting around Polygon Wood, and taking the ammunition up to the gun sites for that Anzac attack on Polygon Wood. They suffered quite considerable casualties, and these 6 men disappeared, possibly in some of the terrible bombardments as they were moving up across that ground. So it gives us an indication that the Commonwealth, the Empire, are very much part of this memorial. We'll come back to that, obviously. But it's when you kind of look at the panels of the gate and you see that almost kind of endless names, that is one of the kind of features of it. As we come across the memorial here, and we're coming into the panels for the Queen's Regiment there, and we've got the Scots Guards, Coldstream Guards, and we're just coming up towards the Grenadier Guards here. And if we focus in on the officers, because the panels here are ordered by regiment and then rank, with the officers first. So the most senior officer on here is Major Colby, and it comes down Captain Rennie. And then if we look at the kind of subalterns, the junior subalterns, Douglas Pennant and Lord Basil Blackwood, kind of gives us an indication of how the aristocracy were very much part of these Guards regiments. And these are men who died in the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. And then as we come along this section of the memorial here, we're coming into one of the archways. And if you've been here to the Menin Gate and you attend the ceremonies, this is where the people come and lay their wreaths during the remembrance ceremony. And this takes us up to the upper level of the gate on this side. We're not going to go up there tonight. We're going to go up the other side. But here we're beginning to come across Australian names, because Australia and Canada have all of their missing for Flanders commemorated on the Menin Gate. They're not split as the British are between here and Tyne Cot. So we've got men, for example, there of the 8th Australian Infantry Battalion who were killed in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. The majority of these Australian names that we can see on the panel here are men who died in that Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. So I'm just going to go to panel 1 for a minute, because there's a couple of things here that I want to show you, again, to kind of hammer home the fact that this is a Commonwealth memorial, because at this part of the gate, we've got Indian Army names. So we've got 36 Sikhs, the Rattrays, 47th Sikhs, Assam Military Police. And this gives us an indication of how important the role of the Indian Army was here during the Great War in the battles of Flanders. Some of the opening shots of the Indian Army service in the European theatre of war was here in Flanders in October of 1914. So it was a really important part of their military history, and the gate commemorates them as well. And this is the first panel, and at the very top is the very first name. Now, my iPhone is not going to do any kind of justice, but up there is Brigadier General Fitzclarence VC. He was an Irish Guards officer who got the Victoria Cross in the Boer War, and during the First Battle of Ypres, a brigade commander who, after the loss of some senior officers, took over a whole section of the battlefield and appointed himself officer commanding Menin Road. And right at the end of the First Battle of Ypres, although he was a senior officer in charge of a lot of men, he couldn't resist leading his old regiment into action. And he was killed at the head of the Irish Guards on the 11th of November 1914 near Polygon Wood, where I was walking with my leisure group this afternoon. And he's the most senior officer on here. So when we look at it, the Menin Gate with the 55,000 names gives us this huge kind of cross-section of the regiments and corps of the British Army, of the Commonwealth forces, and every rank from private to Brigadier General. So a good cross-section of the type of men that were soldiers here during the Great War. And I think not always people read what is on this memorial, and there is the kind of reasoning behind it, because on that panel there it says, here are recorded names of officers and men who fell in the Ypres salient, but to whom the fortune of war denied the known and honoured burial given to their comrades in death. Now, we've looked at the whole kind of history of the missing on the podcast before, on quite a few occasions. And, you know, it is a phenomena of the First World War that so many people were missing in action. And how do you commemorate them? In previous wars, they'd never been commemorated. But as this war had touched almost every family in the land, had gone across all class and social backgrounds, then it was felt that it was unfair for the families of these men to have nothing to see. So we can't underestimate the importance of names like this. You know, as I run my finger across the name of that soldier, Private W.J. Dicker there, you know, for the family of that man, that was quite an important thing to be able to come here and see his name and even touch his name. And that's a really important facet of what these memorials meant to the next of kin who had to deal with the fact that a relative had disappeared forever, and often his fate was completely unknown. Now, I've come over to this side here because I'm going to hold the camera up a little bit and you probably see him, or hopefully see him. We're at the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry panel here, and there's Major T.M. Papineau, MC, Talbot Mercier Papineau. He's one of my lodestars of the Great War. I followed him around the Western Front, and he was an officer who came across to France in 1914, got the Military Cross at Ypres for bravery, fought in the Battle of Bellewaerde, and then became a staff officer where he remained at the base and escorting the Canadian official photographers around the battlefield until one day he received a letter accusing him of being a coward, skulking at the base. So he asked for a transfer back to his old regiment, the PPCLI, and he joined them in time for the Third Battle of Ypres and was killed in action there in the attack on Passchendaele on the 30th of October, 1917. And his body was never found, although there is a record of his body being found and buried after the war. The location of his grave could not be found, and that's why his name is here on the Menin Gate. And every time I stand here, and I have no idea how many times I've stood here over the years, I've always come across to see his name or glanced across to his name because, like I say, he's one of those Great War lodestars. Now, over the years of coming here with Ledger Battlefield tours, you know, I've been here with the families of many people who have names on this memorial and have come here to see their names, including back in the early days of Ledger, people whose fathers were on here. And I remember a few of them were soldiers in the Second World War. And one of them said he was coming through the gate, through that archway just there, in the back of an army truck in September 1944, heading up to take part in Operation Market Garden. And he suddenly realized that he was in Ypres, and this was the Menin Gate, and his dad was on there. He jumped off the back of the truck. He ran across the roadway here up to the panel, and his dad was on one of the panels just towards the end of the memorial just here. He jumped out, looked at his dad's name, reached up to touch him, realized the trucks are moving on, and then he rushed through the archway again and jumped into the back of the truck and moved onwards, ever onwards, towards Arnhem, and another war and another battle. And we're going to go up the steps here, but there's a panel here I'm going to stop at. Now, again, if you listen to the podcast, you know that I'm from Sussex, and I'm particularly interested in the Royal Sussex Regiment, so it's no surprise that we're going to stop here at the Royal Sussex Regiment panel. We've got some very interesting characters on here. Lieutenant Colonel Crispin, who you might be able to see just here. He was the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion. He arrived, he was their second commanding officer. The first one had been killed on the Aisne in September 1914, and he arrived in time for the First Battle of Ypres, but on the back of a white charger. And he cantered up the Menin Road towards the woods just beyond what became Clapham Junction when a shell went off next to his horse, and it bolted across the field straight into the path of German machine gun fire, and he was killed. The men recovered his body, and he was taken back down to be buried as to where, just on the spot where the Hoog Crater Cafe is today. But of course, that became an area of mining activity and heavy shelling and fighting later in the war, and his grave was lost, which is why his name is on the memorial here. We've also got quite a few subalterns, and I know John Hayes Fisher, my old pal's listening, and his uncle Wilfred Fisher is on the memorial just here. But just beneath him, there's Wilfred Fisher just here. Just beneath him is Marillia, Second Lieutenant FCJ Marillia. Now, he's an interesting character because he'd had an argument with his father before the war, and he ran off to join the regular army as an ordinary soldier. And you'll see at the end there, it says DCM. So he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for bravery as a sergeant in the 2nd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment. And then following the award of that DCM, he was given a field commission and then became a 2nd lieutenant and was killed in action at the end of the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. So in just the space of a few months, he went from being a sergeant, awarded the DCM, commissioned in the field, and then killed in action on the battlefield before the first year of the war was even over. 2nd Lieutenant W.J. Collier there, he was in the 11th Royal Sussex. He was one of Edmund Blunden's friends. He'd gone to Christ's Hospital with a fellow pupil at Christ's Hospital. Edmund Blunden himself was a pupil there. But I mean, there are so many names on these memorials, so many stories. And another one that I kind of stop at here is, I'll try and do this without falling down the stairs, is this chap here, Len West. And I've got his medals. He's a South Downer. He's in the 13th Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment. And you see he's got the military medal. And he was a stretcher bearer. So he was a regimental stretcher bearer. And he got his military medal at Richborg on the 30th of June, 1916. We're coming up to the anniversary of Richborg this week. And he got it there for going out under fire and the fighting at the Boar's Head, picking up the wounded and bringing them in. He was decorated with the military medal. He served on the Somme. His brother was killed beside him on the Somme in October 1916. They were from Eastbourne in Sussex. And he went home on leave, saw his family, probably had to break the news to his mother, the details of what had happened to his brother. And then he returned to the front and he was killed in action on the 31st of July, 1917, when the stretcher bearers and the medical officer of the battalion took over a captured German bunker, and then a shell pitched in through the door and killed them all, including him. So his war came to an end there under tragic circumstances. 2 brothers killed, his brother killed on the Somme and him killed here at the 3rd Battle of Ypres. So again, you know, I think we've all got these connections to these places one way or another, whether it's a photograph or a medal or a memorial plaque. And I think those kind of connections are so important, really. Now, this kind of part of the Menin Gate going up, and there's quite a lot of background noise, so I hope what I'm saying is coming through. But this part of the Menin Gate takes us up to the upper level of the gate, which we're gonna go and have a look at now. And as we come up to here, we're coming up as well to more of the Canadian names. You can see the steps coming up. I'm conscious that quite a few of you probably have never been here, so it's probably quite intriguing to see how this memorial is laid out. And hopefully as we come up here, it might be not quite so loud. And we're coming up to the Canadian names, the continuation of the Canadian names. And on this particular panel here, we've got a lot of men from the Canadian Mounted Rifles. And this was an infantry battalion, despite its name. And most of these names, you can see, there's a hell of a lot of names on here from the Canadian Mounted Rifles. Most of these men died in June 1916, when the Germans blew mines underneath the CMR's positions across from the Menin Road near Hoog to Sanctuary Wood, to Observatory Ridge and that kind of sector there. And many of these men were literally blown smithereens by the explosion of these mines underneath the trenches there. And entire platoons, if not nearly companies, of these CMR guys disappeared with the explosion of these mines. So this is a particularly tragic part of the Menin Gate where these Canadian names are. And there's many famous Canadian battalions on here. We spoke about the Kootenays, the 54th Battalion, when we did an episode on Vimy Ridge recently, and these are some of the 54th Battalion men killed in the Ypres salient before they moved down to the Somme. And we're looking up to kind of the upper section of the gate now, which we're going to walk up to, and we'll have a kind of a continued chat. So far, the technology seems to be holding out, so that's good. There's mobile signal, unless I'm talking to myself. Things seem to be going okay, and we're coming up to the top of the gate here, up on top of the ramparts. And one of the things that we've got here is a bronze model of the Menin Gate. And this was put here for blind people so that they could come in and literally kind of touch the gate like this and kind of feel it. And I think the power of touch is really important, really, really important, to come here and not just see the monument, but to touch the memorial. You know, history is a tactile thing, I think, really, in many respects, and it's really important to do that. But we'll come round to here, to this side of it, just to have a chat a little bit more about what's in this part of the memorial, and then just have maybe a kind of general chat about the gates, and then we might move on to a few questions at the end, if I can keep the technology going. So this is part of the gate. I don't think a lot of people come up here, but this is the extension of the names, because with 55,000 names on here, there's a lot of panels and they need a lot of space to do that. And there's some features on here which I think are great. You know, we're looking there to the spire of St. Jack's Church, close to the Menin Gate, which you can see from a lot of parts of the battlefield. And we've got these bronze lions, you know, similar to the lions of the Menin Gate that we saw outside. And I think that's kind of an important feature to it. And they're all along the fencing of this part of the memorial. And on this side, we're in an area where there's a lot of territorial regiments, including men from London. So the London Rifle Brigade, Henry Williamson's old regiment, and men that he served with. Second Lieutenant Lintott, who's on here, is one of Henry Williamson's friends. He mentions him in his writing, and he went to school in Sussex, and the children from that school come to the memorial on a regular basis to visit his name, which is quite a nice thing, but that continues. And when we come up here, I mean, at times it's a bit overwhelming when we look at all these different names and we see and realise that each one of them is a life, is a person, is a human, is an individual who had dreams, who had desires, who had wants and needs, and thought of a world and a future beyond the war, but the war claimed them and their future was lost. So it's the tragedy, really. And with the missing, with no grave to see, with no sepulchre to visit except a name on a wall, as we've said before, you know, how difficult was that for families to come to terms with? And, you know, was it easier for the families who came here, who could stand as I'm standing now and run their fingers across the names? Was it easier for them because they could visibly and actually touch the name? And how hard was it for the ones whose relatives were at the very top? Who knows? I mean, it's kind of all the aspects of how these men are commemorated and all of what that meant that we can consider as we come up here. But bear with me just for a minute. Okay. So, I mean, having come up here, it's quite good to kind of think about, you know, what memorials like this mean to us. It's a place where people come to remember the Great War on a nightly basis with the playing of The Last Post, and people who have only a passing interest in the First World War will come here to do that, and perhaps it might make them think about reading a book, listening to a podcast, watching a video, you know, whatever it is, and I think that's good. But for many people whose connection to the Great War is kind of much deeper, I think coming to this place kind of opens as many questions as answers that we can find by coming here. And again, you know, like we're thinking, you know, about the missing and what it means with soldiers disappearing. You know, I'm standing there and looking at two men with the same name. Are they brothers? And I know on this memorial, there's the Rachel brothers, the Royal Fusiliers who were from West London. And Mrs. Rachel received a telegram to say all three of her boys had been killed in action on the same day in May 1915, and none of them had a known grave. And how terrible must that have been, you know, for the loss of those three sons, and how worse it must have been when you consider that there was never going to be a grave for her to see. Did she come? And, you know, in the coming episode we've got for this weekend, where we look at some objects of the Great War, I kind of think about an element of the paperwork of these men on these memorials. And when you look at the response rates for the families of the missing, so those who responded to questions and demands for information from the Imperial War Graves Commission, then often they never replied, because it was an acceptance. If you replied and you gave information about your son, your brother, your husband, then you were accepting they were dead. And for many people, they could never accept that they were dead. And there are all sorts of stories. If you read Len MacDonald's, they called it Passchendaele, you can read about the families who never accepted that someone was dead, a mother never accepting that her son was gone forever. And she goes down the local market and she sees a young man similar in stature, similar in size to her boy, and taps him on the shoulder thinking it's him, but it's not. He's never coming back, because his name is on a memorial like this, commemorating those who have no known grave, lost forever on the battlefields here of Flanders, and the other monuments on the key battlefields like the Somme or Loos and Arras and all the many other battlefields of the Great War. Anyway, what we're going to do, we're going to kind of walk round to that part of the ramparts just round there, and then go and have a look at the Indian Memorial, which some people are not so aware of. I can see a couple of questions popping up. Bear with me, I can't always initially respond to them. We'll come to questions shortly, I hope. And I'll also just come down to this side of the gate just here. So we're looking, there's St. Jack's Church. We're looking down, there's a few happy drinkers down there at the local bar. And then we've got the street going up towards the main square of Ypres. And we're looking across the rooftops of Ypres now. And I'm just going to walk you over to the Indian Memorial. It's good to see kind of how used the Menin Gate is, not by pilgrims like ourselves, not by historians, not by those connected to the Great War, but by local people. And a lot of people kind of see it as part of their landscape. And I think their connection and their involvement with it, is seeing it as part of their landscape, is really, really important, because we want the people of Flanders, we want the people of Ypres to be feeling as invested in this as much as we are. So this is a new memorial that went up around the time of the centenary. It's an Indian memorial that commemorates the Indian troops, India in Flanders fields, as it says on there. And as we said, you know, the Menin Gate doesn't just commemorate those who were from Britain. It commemorates, you know, the wider empire, and that's a really important part of what this memorial is about. And we've got a kind of side view of the Menin Gate there again, which is one that I think not so many people come up to see, and it's a really important one. So I'm going to kind of stop talking there, because I can see questions coming up. And what I'll do is, I can't, normally I would say to you, pop your hand up and speak, but I'm working on an iPhone screen here, and I can't entirely do that. So what I'm going to do is say to you, if you've got a question you'd like to ask, open up your mic, say hello, and we'll do what we can to answer it. So fire away with your questions if you've got any. And I'm just going to move over to a part of the gate just over there. Okay. So, great. Thank you. Thank you, John. So I think it's kind of worked. I hope it has. It's been quite difficult. I could have done with about 4 different eyes looking at different bits of it here. But I'll just come over to near the gate again, and I might kind of set the camera up on the wall here. And then if anyone would like to say anything or ask a question, then please kind of do so. So bear with me. Ooh, a few fingers there. Okay. Okay. So.
Yes, please, Paul. Can I say something?
Of course you can, yeah. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Judy.
Yeah, hi. My grandmother's cousin was killed on the 9th of August at Hooge,
Okay.
1915, and I've got the correspondence. He's on panel 55, I think it is, on the gate. I have seen it. I've got the correspondence between his father and the War Office, and it was clearly they were absolutely desperate for information, and it really touched me reading this letter, or these letters. So yeah, what you said about the lady who was desperate to see her son again, yeah, really hit home, because those letters were really, and the War Office couldn't say,
no.
No,
I mean, people, as you say, people were literally desperate for information, and they turned to so many different methods to try and get that information, from writing to the comrades of some of the soldiers, to putting adverts in newspapers, and contacting the Red Cross, and often hoping against hope that they were going to turn up in a hospital somewhere or at a German prisoner of war camp. But of course they weren't. They were never coming back.
No, his father mentioned, so is he in a hospital somewhere? And of course he wasn't. He was at Hooge somewhere, blown to pieces.
Yeah, yeah. It's so sad, yeah. And so difficult for those families to come to terms with, I think.
I don't think, from what I can gather from my mother, I don't think his father ever did.
No.
Remembered his father. And, yeah.
No, thank you for that insight, Judy.
So thank you very much. It's been great.
Great, thank you. If anyone else wants to come in, by all means do so.
Paul?
Hi.
Hi, Paul. It's Stephen here in Southport. Just a very quick question. Why Sergeant spelled with a J?
That's a good question. So at the time of the Great War, up until the Second World War, in British military records, Sergeant was always spelled with a J. Right. I would guess that at some point we nicked that rank from the French, Sergeant, and we spelt it in the French manner. But sometime around about post-Second World War period, then they changed it to G. So it was a common usage change, basically, from J to G. And if you look at the medals of the Great War, for example, when the rank of sergeant is engraved on the medals, it's SJT, not SGT.
Right.
But today, of course, we kind of would think that it should be SGT, but it was SJT then. So that's what it is, a common usage change.
Thanks very much, Paul. Cheers.
No problem. Thanks for coming, Stephen. Now, unlike normally, I can't see you all in the kind of in a kind of matrix of faces. So if anyone, normally I'd say like put your hand up, but if anyone wants to speak, just kind of pitch in, by all means do so. And then go on.
Hi, Paul. I was going to ask, in the Second World War, was there much damage caused to the Menin Gate, or did it just survive intact throughout the whole period?
Well, there was that damage at the front, and I'm looking at now, I can see quite a few parts of the gate that were impacted by the explosion and by shrapnel, because the Germans were sending shells over from the battlefields outside of Ypres into the city of Ypres. And I think something like 500 buildings in Ypres were damaged in 1940. Not on the scale of the First World War, but they were damaged. And you can still see the evidence of that as you walk around the city today. There's impact marks on the brickwork, on some of the walls, and probably up on the roofs as well. So quite a lot of buildings were damaged because the Germans were dropping bombs as well as dropping artillery fire. But the gate, in terms of the overall structure of it, was not kind of damaged to the point that it needed major repair, except at the front. And a 20mm flat gun came around the corner at one stage and opened fire on the top of the monument, because there were British soldiers on the roof of it, and it took out chunks of the lion at the front, the main lion, and that had to be repaired after the war. But what's interesting, when the Imperial War Graves Commission came back through here in September 1944, having come from the breakout in Normandy across northern France up into Flanders, I think they expected to find cemeteries demolished or in a very poor condition, but generally they found them in pretty good condition. And in some cases, the gardeners have continued to work there right throughout the 4 years of the occupation by the Germans. So it's interesting to see, really, relatively speaking, how little damage was done. But great question, though. Thank you.
Hi there, Paul. Yeah, long time.
Hi, Jack.
Yeah,
You all right?
yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, really, really good to see it again. I haven't been for many years. I have put a question on the actual on the Zoom call itself, but how far do the ramparts go, and can you walk all across them just to your right in this instance where the memorial is?
You can. I mean, they start once they went all around the city, but by the time of the First World War, they demolished about 2/3 of them. So there's a section that runs from just north of the Menin Gate up to the Menin Gate, and then the Menin Gate obviously gets in the way of it because there was a natural gap in the ramparts at that point anyway, which was what the Menin Gate originally was. It was a route out of the city. And each one was named after the town that the road that went through that gap went to. So the Menin Gate was the Menin Gate because the road took them to Menin. The Lille Gate was a Lille Gate because it took them to Lille. There was a Dixmude Gate as well, and so on. And so from here, it continues for about a mile and a bit around the edge of the city, round to the Rampart Cemetery near the Lille Gate, which is quite a nice walk to do from the Menin Gate around the ramparts to the Lille Gate. And then it continues beyond that to near the railway station. And at that end of it, there's a couple of pop-up British machine gun bunkers from the First World War that are still there. So actually on top of the ramparts, there is quite a lot to see that dates from the pre-First World War period that was then used by British troops during the First World War. And to my right now, I'm kind of looking down the ramparts there. Troops slept up on top of the ramparts during the First World War in the early years of the war. They were billeted on top of the ramparts. There was a cemetery, another cemetery a little bit further down here that was then removed, and I think it went to Aeroplane Cemetery near Portesa. The graves were moved there after the war. And there was all the kind of sally ports and the steps and the tunnels underneath the ramparts and all the casemates underneath the ramparts that were used as well. And they've opened up a few of those, but not all of them. And at certain times, they've actually opened up some of the chambers within the ramparts that you can go into. At the far end of the Lille Gate, one of those was used as one of the earliest war museums here. So they kind of had a continuous use. And there's a very nice bar just down behind me on my right, which is where the Ypres Times was printed, which is, again, a bit of the old ramparts that's still in use. And that's a good thing, like I was saying, for the local people to be invested in all this. It can't be a museum. It has to be a landscape that is fluid in some respects, in terms of the remembrance sits at the heart and is part of it. But these men fought and died so that Belgium could be free. And it's important that Belgian people can go about their lives and live their lives amongst it all.
Thanks. Yeah, no, brilliant. It's really bizarre as well, because just in the local war memorial in our little village, there's a guy called Weeks, but he's spelt differently, and his name is the same on the Menin Gate as well. It says Weeks,
Right.
but slightly different as well. He's almost got like two names for him. But
Wow.
yeah, thanks again. Cheers.
Good stuff. Thanks, Jack. Good to see you, mate.
All right, you too.
Anyone else like to come in?
Hi, Paul. It's Ron Slater here.
Hi, Ron.
Old friend from the Henry Williams Society. Yeah, it's been a really terrific walk round tonight, because several times I've been there, sometimes with yourself, and laid wreaths on behalf of the society up on those steps and whatever. But I've never taken the opportunity to walk up the back there and see that model and see the Indian. Can you tell me, are there any other countries that have put separate memorials around there?
No, I think that possibly that I think that as we move forward again post-COVID, some of that might happen. I've heard rumours of some new memorials, but I think that what's interesting is the kind of response to the kind of non-standard British aspects of the Great War and commemorating those. And I think that's rightly done. That it's not kind of tokenism. It's really important to recognise the role of troops like Indian troops or West Indian troops, South African Native Labour Corps, and all that kind of stuff. So I would hope that, we've got a kind of an area behind me now. My love of birds, I can just see a thrush going across the grass there. And there is a kind of an area there potentially for memorials. And I know people say, it could be too many memorials. But I think these things are important to record because, a lot of people of a lot of different nationalities come here, and you don't want any of them to kind of feel excluded from this, because it is a multinational, multi-faith multi-denominational monument. It's kind of not just Christian. It represents many men from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds, and I think that's part of the power of it, really.
Yeah, that's great vlog.
Thank you. Cheers, Ron. So, would anyone else like to pitch in? And then I might. Not sure where I'm at.
Hi, Paul. Are there
Hi
any?
there, John.
Are there any of the Chinese Labour Corps on Menin Gate?
There aren't, no, and I think there's some Chinese Labour Corps lost at sea in the First World War, but I'm trying to think of any that are on memorials to the missing, because they never really got to near the front line in the same way that some of the other Labour troops, like the British West Indies, did. So I don't believe there are. I'm pretty sure there are no Chinese names on the Menin Gate or Tyncott or Thiepval or something like that. But there are some of them on memorials to men lost at sea. So I think that's the only missing from that unit, really. But I mean, there's plenty. I mean, I'm not very far from where I'm standing now. There is a cemetery with the dead from some of the dead from the Chinese Labour Corps who died in 1919 in that clearance up of the battlefield. So, it's they're out there, but with graves rather than names on memorials. Thanks, John.
Which direction is the famous chestnut tree?
That's to my right, actually. Yeah, it's a little bit further down the ramparts. We can't even see it from here, so everything's in bloom at the moment. So it's kind of slightly out of view, but yeah, it's still there, thankfully.
Like Ron, I've never been up on top of the ramparts, and so but I'm back in October. I'll have to get myself dragged up there and have a look around.
Yep, no, that's great. I hope you do. It's worth coming up.
Paul, if I may.
Yeah, of course. Hi, Pete.
Absolutely fantastic. This is brilliant to see this. And I hope you do a few more of these. I mean, I'm obviously thinking of the other major places, but how about Delville Wood, for example? This sort of thing, absolutely brilliant. This is there. Superb.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I'm looking at. I mean, at some point, when I get 5 minutes, I'm going to come over and record some video at some of these places as well to kind of put on for supporters like yourselves. But yeah, in terms of live streams, I've got to be staying nearby, because this week I'm actually out on a tour doing a walking tour. So I've kind of sneaked out this evening to come and do this. But it's a bit far for me to walk 100 clicks down the Western Front to Delville Wood, but it's a good idea. I mean, I'm hoping that kind of when I'm back in some of these places outside of touring, that we can do some of these evenings and do that. So yeah, it's on the radar, shall we say? It's on the radar, but a great suggestion.
But congratulations, it's been bloody marvellous. I'm sure everybody else would say the same. Cheers.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad it's worked.
Terrific.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, good thing it's not raining. Well, you say that, Mary. It's going to rain. The sky is kind of darkening, actually, and we've got rain forecast for tomorrow. So when I'm walking tomorrow, I think it's going to be typical Flanders, and I'm going to be wet through. At least no one's shelling us and shooting at us, so we should be okay. We should be okay. Okay, would anyone else like to pitch in?
Paul, it's Richard Croft here.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Paul. Just a quick question. I don't know whether I've dreamt this, but subsequently, when men have been named on the Menin Gate, and then their bodies have been located and identified, their names have been removed from the gate. Did I dream that, or is that a fact?
No, they're only digitally removed from the gates, so their names are still on here.
Yeah.
But they do have a known grave, so they're doubly commemorated. Basically, the only memorial where they've removed names is the Thiepval memorial on the Somme, where they physically removed them in the 90s. And I'd have to say that I think the Commission probably regrets that now, because it does look a bit odd with these gaps in the lists. So the Menin Gate, the only time names are removed is if an entire block of names has deteriorated to a level where it has to be taken out, because they're blocks that are slotted into the wall. And if a block has to be taken out and re-engraved, and they know that this or that name is now they've got a known grave, then they'll remove that name and re-engrave the entire panel. But I don't believe that has happened on this memorial. I know Sarah Nathaniel's here tonight. She might be able to kind of say otherwise, but I don't believe that it's happened on this memorial. But virtually, so if you look them up online, they will tell you where they are now buried. And the thing about this, as with all the memorials to the missing, you know, this went up in 1927, so that was nearly a decade after the Great War, and it took several years to compile the information to have the right names on here. And by the time the monument was unveiled, I think it was well over 300 men whose names were on this memorial had already been found in that decade after the Great War. So it was already out of date by the time it was open to the public, if you like. And that's the kind of nature of it, I think, really. But so you can, I mean, I know of some names that are on here of men when we were looking at the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry names, where Talbot Papineau was. Just beneath him is Lieutenant Agar, and he's now got a marked grave in Passchendaele New British Cemetery. So, that you know, there are men who are doubly commemorated on here. The American practice on their memorials to the missing, which I kind of think maybe we should do, is they put a little bronze disc next to the name on their memorials in First and Second World War American memorial chapels in their war cemeteries to indicate that that soldier has now been found. So, and that would be a visible way to kind of look at some of the panels here and see that, you know, men had been found.
Good stuff. Thank you. Thank you very much.
No problem. Pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks, Richard.
Hi, Paul.
Hi.
It's Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I don't,
You're
do you
right.
know, I don't actually know the answer to that, but I will find out. I'll ask one of my colleagues and let everybody know the definitive answer on that.
Great.
I was just going to say, it's not a question really, more of a sort of an observation. Really interested in your thoughts on it. Obviously, there's the big renovation project planned for the Menin Gate next year, which is obviously is going to be a massive undertaking, and it's just, you know, sort of watching you wandering around there. It's just every time we discuss it in any of our kind of meetings, the question is always asked, how on earth are they going to do that? And I don't don't think anybody's kind of quite come up with the answer yet, but it's it could potentially be a real sort of logistical nightmare, couldn't it, with the obviously with the road running through and the last post ceremony. And
definitely. I mean, I honestly, I don't have an answer to that one. I've thought this myself. How is it going to work? Because it's such it's a main thoroughfare for not just us visiting the battlefields, but for the people who live here in Ypres. You know, as I've stood here now, one of the reasons I've got this kind of shot set up is that I'm kind of out of the field of view of people coming by, and there's people who've been walking their dog and they're taking their bike across the top of the ramparts and down through the Menin Gate out to where they live, somewhere on the outskirts of Ypres or whatever, and all that kind of stuff is going on apart from us visiting the memorial. So I don't know. I would pose that question back to you in the commission. I don't have an answer for that one.
Well, I'll let you know when I hear anything, because it will be interesting to see how they manage it, I think. Good.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think everyone accepts that it needs to be done. It's a really essential thing. And you know, I've seen on Twitter recently 1 or 2 comments from people saying, "Oh, is Thiepval not finished?" You know, etc. I mean, these are massive structures that sit in the open for 365 days of the year, and that they are going to be affected by the weather and deterioration and so on. And you know, we want to see them looking their best, don't we? And the only way to do that is to close them down for a while and look after them.
There has to be work every once in a while.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that, you know, hand on heart, most of us wouldn't see a kind of a problem with that, really.
No.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Anyone else would like to say anything? Otherwise, I might kind of close this down. Hiya.
Hi, Paul. Just a question regarding the names on the Menin Gate. I noticed some are painted in black. And some memorials, let's just see at Thiepval, they're not. Do you have any idea why?
Well, the last time they did a major renovation, they used a thing where they covered the panels in something that looked like wallpaper, like lining paper, and they then burnt it off with a blowtorch, and it leaves this residue in the names. It makes the names stand out, and it's, as far as I'm aware, it is unique to this memorial. It doesn't damage the stone, as far as I'm aware, but what it does do, it makes the names incredibly visible in a way that, you know, I know yourself would have looked at the Arras Memorial, you know, many years ago, and when the rain was coming down through the roof there, it was very difficult to see some of the names. Whether it's not practical on other monuments, you know, I don't know really, but it is kind of unique. Although it's not everywhere. I'm looking down into some of those Canadian names I was saying, they haven't had that process done to them. No. The upper panel has, the main road panels have been done like that, but these ones haven't. So whether that will be done with the renovations that Sarah was talking about, I don't know, but let's hope so.
Thank you.
And I've got a couple from Wombwell with me, Neil. So you'll approve of that. So it's a good Yorkshire. We're having a good Yorkshire tour here.
Lovely, great. Thank you.
Okay, mate. See you soon.
You.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. Would anyone else like to come in? Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bid you all good night, because I can see my battery coming down a bit now. And
sorry, Paul.
Go on. Oh yeah. Go on then.
Did the commission use a special font for the memorials at all?
I believe they did. What that font is, I honestly don't know. I guess if we had some font experts with us, they'd probably give it chapter and verse, and I'm sure there are font experts, but I don't know what it is. But it is a kind of slightly different font to what you see on the gravestones, the original headstones from that period. Whether that was done deliberately or why that was done, I don't know. But it definitely is a different font, I would say.
Lovely. Thank you very much for all you're doing.
No problem. Thanks for joining us. Okay then, ladies and gents, I'm going to bid you good night from Flanders and the Menin Gate. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us here this evening. This is the first one of these that we've done, and I'm hoping it won't certainly be the last. And thanks for your patience, and fantastically, the technology has worked out so great. So thanks all. Thank you very much. And, and for those listening on repeat, because I have recorded this, so I'm going to put it on so that some of the other podcast supporters can watch this later on. Thank you for joining as well if you're listening to this later. But good night to everybody, and I'll see you all soon. And
thanks, Paul.
Until we meet.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank
Until
you.
we meet again on the old front line. Thank you.
Cheers, Paul. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.